Daniel Reyes hadn't slept well in weeks. Not because of the usual things, traffic, late-night emails, or even the occasional investor panic. No, it was something quieter, heavier. It sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't shake. His company, Reyes Auto Care, had grown from a single garage in Tucson to over 60 locations across the Southwest. On paper, everything looked perfect. Revenue up, expansion on track, customer satisfaction scores hovering just above the industry average. But something felt off. He'd started noticing it in the little things. The way his regional managers always smiled a little too quickly during calls. The way complaints from employees seemed to vanish before reaching his desk. The fact that every time he visited a shop, dressed in his usual sharp suit, flanked by assistants, everyone suddenly worked twice as fast, spoke twice as politely, and avoided eye contact just enough to seem rehearsed. It wasn't dishonesty. It was fear. And fear, Daniel knew, was the enemy of truth. One rainy Tuesday evening, while scrolling through an anonymous employee forum, something he'd only recently discovered, he read a post that stopped him cold. Worked at Reyes Auto Care Phoenix for 6 months, it said. Great pay, but if you mess up once, your lead tech makes sure you never forget it. Feels like walking on eggshells. The comment had only 2 replies, both dismissive. That's just how shops are, and get tougher or get out. But Daniel didn't believe that. He remembered his own first job, sweeping floors at a muffler shop at 16, hands raw from degreaser, ears ringing from the air wrenches. The owner, a gruff man named Lou, had yelled plenty, sure, but he'd also stayed late to show him how to read a torque wrench, how to listen to an engine like it was talking. That shop hadn't just fixed cars. It had built people. Now, decades later, Daniel wondered, had his success buried that spirit? He made a decision that night. No announcements, no security detail, no corporate spin. He'd go back to where it all began, not as the CEO, but as someone invisible. Someone who could hear what people really said when no one important was listening. The next morning, he called in sick, something he hadn't done in 15 years, and drove his oldest car, a dented 2008 sedan he kept for sentimental reasons, to a discount hair salon near the airport. He asked for a darker dye, a little scruff, and a haircut that looked like it hadn't seen a barber in months. Then he hit a thrift store, bought a pair of worn steel-toed boots, faded jeans, and a set of navy coveralls with someone else's name stitched over the pocket. He scrubbed his hands with pumice soap until they looked rough, tucked his wedding ring into his wallet, and practiced walking with a slight slouch, less confidence, more caution. By the time he walked into the Reyes Auto Care location on 32nd Street in Phoenix, he barely recognized himself. He used a fake name, Danny Ruiz, and a backstory he'd rehearsed in the mirror. Recently moved from El Paso, worked at a small family garage, looking for steady work and a chance to learn. The hiring manager, a tired-looking woman named Lisa with coffee stains on her clipboard, barely glanced at his resume. "We're short-staffed," she said. "Can you start Monday?" He could, and he did. His first day felt like stepping into a different world. The air smelled of burnt oil, rubber, and stale coffee. Radios played a mix of classic rock and Spanish-language talk shows. Men and women in grease-smeared uniforms moved with purpose, calling out part numbers, arguing over diagnostic codes, laughing over someone's botched oil change. No one looked at him twice. To them, he was just another new guy. Quiet, maybe a little awkward, but willing to fetch tools and clean drip pans without complaining. Daniel kept his mouth shut and his eyes open. He watched how the veterans handled customers, some with patience, others with barely concealed annoyance. He saw how the younger techs deferred to the leads, how a single sharp word from a supervisor could silence a whole bay. He also noticed the little acts of kindness. A senior mechanic showing a trainee how to bleed brakes without spilling fluid. Someone sharing their lunch when a coworker forgot theirs. A quick high five after a tough job was done right. But beneath it all there was tension. A kind of unspoken pressure, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to go wrong. At lunch, he sat alone on a plastic crate behind the shop, eating a sandwich from the gas station across the street. That's when he first saw Mateo. The kid couldn't have been more than 19, with tired eyes and calloused hands that moved too fast, like he was trying to prove he belonged. He was wrestling with a stubborn alternator bolt, sweat dripping down his temple. When he finally got it loose, he let out a quiet, "Yes." That sounded more like relief than triumph. Daniel almost smiled. He remembered that feeling, the small victories that felt huge when you were starting out. Later that afternoon, during a lull in work, Daniel overheard two techs talking near the parts counter. "You hear about what happened to Rico last week?" one asked, voice low. "Yeah," the other replied, shaking his head. "Said he missed a recall notice on a brake job. Vince chewed him out so bad he didn't come back Monday. Figures. That guy's got a temper like a rattlesnake." Daniel didn't ask who Vince was. He didn't need to. He'd already seen him. A broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a permanent scowl and a habit of standing too close when he spoke. Vince ran Bay 3 like a drill sergeant, and everyone seemed to move faster when he was around. That night, back in his cheap motel room with its thin walls and flickering lamp, Daniel wrote in a small notebook he'd bought at the drugstore. Not corporate jargon, just observations. Mateo works hard but looks scared. Vince interrupts people mid-sentence. No one laughs when he's nearby. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the AC and the distant sound of highway traffic. For the first time in years, he felt like he was seeing his own company clearly, not through spreadsheets and strategy decks, but through the eyes of the people who actually kept it running. He didn't know it yet, but in 2 days, he'd hear something that would change everything, something that would force him to choose between staying hidden or stepping back into the light. But for now, he just closed his eyes, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. Tomorrow he'd be back on the floor, just another trainee learning how to change a fuel pump, watching, listening, remembering what it meant to be human in a world that often rewarded the opposite. By the end of his first week, Daniel had stopped flinching every time a socket clattered to the concrete floor. He'd learned to tell the difference between the whine of a bad alternator and the rattle of loose heat shielding. He could change oil without spilling a drop, and he'd even started recognizing customers by the sound of their engines before they pulled into the bay. But more than that, he'd begun to feel something he hadn't in years, invisible in the best possible way. No one expected anything from Danny Ruiz. No presentations. No decisions. No pressure to perform except the quiet kind that came from wanting to do right by the person next to you. And that person, more often than not, was Mateo. The kid was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. He carried a battered notebook filled with sketches of engine layouts and notes in tight, careful handwriting. He asked questions, not the showy kind, but the real ones. Why does this hose keep cracking? Or how do you know when a timing belt's about to go? Daniel answered as best he could, sticking to the basics, careful not to reveal too much knowledge. But sometimes, when no one else was around, he'd show Mateo a trick, like using a rubber mallet to loosen a stubborn pulley, or how to listen for a vacuum leak with a length of old hose held to your ear. "You pick up things fast," Daniel said one afternoon, watching Mateo reassemble a fuel injector rail with steady hands. Mateo shrugged, wiping grease from his brow with the back of his wrist. "Gotta. My little sister starts community college next month. I'm covering her books." Daniel didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. He saw it in the way Mateo double-checked every invoice, in the way he saved his coffee grounds to reuse the next day, in the quiet pride he took in finishing a job without help. This wasn't just a job for him. It was a lifeline. Meanwhile, the rhythm of the shop settled into something almost musical. Mornings started with the clatter of toolboxes opening, and the hiss of air compressors powering up. Midday brought the lunch rush, older sedans with warning lights, pickup trucks with suspension issues, the occasional luxury car driven by someone who barely knew how to check their oil. Afternoon slowed, giving way to deeper repairs and the occasional emergency tow-in. Most of the crew were decent people. There was Rosa, a veteran tech with 20 years under her belt who ran Bay 2 like a well-oiled machine and always had a spare granola bar for anyone who skipped breakfast. There was Dev, a lanky guy in his 30s who played guitar on breaks and could diagnose an electrical gremlin faster than anyone. Even the shop foreman Carl seemed fair, firm but respectful, the kind of leader who led by example, not intimidation. Then there was Vince. He didn't yell, not often anyway. But his presence was like a shadow that fell over the whole bay whenever he walked by. He'd stand behind you while you worked, arms crossed, saying nothing. Or he'd correct your work by redoing it himself without explanation, tossing your parts into the bin like they were trash. He never said good job, He only pointed out what you missed. Daniel saw how the younger techs tensed when Vince approached. How they'd second-guess themselves, slow down, or worse, rush through steps just to get it over with. Mistakes followed. And when they did, Vince made sure everyone heard about it. One Tuesday, a trainee named Eli mislabeled a brake fluid reservoir during a routine service. It wasn't a dangerous error. The cap was color-coded and the senior tech caught it before the car left. But Vince made it feel like a felony. "You think this is a joke?" he snapped, loud enough for half the shop to hear. "One drop of the wrong fluid in there and that brake system's toast. You could have killed someone. You're lucky I'm feeling generous today." Eli turned red, mumbled an apology, and spent the rest of the day avoiding eye contact. Daniel watched from across the bay, wrench in hand, stomach tight. He wanted to say something, but what could Danny Ruiz say? He was nobody. Just another new guy trying not to get noticed. That night, over lukewarm takeout in his motel room, Daniel wrote in his notebook, "Fear doesn't make people better. It makes them smaller." The next morning, Vince assigned Daniel and Mateo to a full brake job on a minivan. It was a straightforward job. Rotors, pads, fluid flush. But Vince hovered nearby, arms crossed, watching like a hawk. Halfway through, Mateo dropped a caliper bolt. It rolled under the lift. "Seriously?" Vince said, voice low but sharp. "You've been doing this how long? Pick it up. And don't scratch the rotor." Mateo scrambled after it, face burning. Daniel stayed quiet, but his jaw tightened. Later, when Vince walked away to take a call, Mateo whispered, "I swear I'm not clumsy. I get nervous when he's watching, I know," Daniel said softly. "But you're doing fine. Better than fine." Mateo gave a small, grateful nod. That tiny moment of connection, just two people sharing a truth in a noisy garage, felt more real than any board meeting Daniel had ever attended. As the days passed, Daniel found himself looking forward to the shop. Not because of the work, but because of the people. He liked the way Rosa hummed old Motown songs while she worked. He liked how Dev always offered to help clean up at the end of the day, even if it wasn't his mess. He liked the way Mateo's eyes lit up when he finally figured something out on his own. But he also saw the cracks. The way some techs avoided certain bays. The way complaints about tools going missing or schedules changing last minute were brushed off with, "That's just how it is." And always the unspoken rule, "Don't cross Vince." Daniel started paying closer attention. He noticed Vince taking longer breaks than everyone else. He saw him argue with Carl once about overtime, his voice rising just enough to make others glance over. He even caught him pocketing a customer's leftover oil change coupon. Small things maybe, but they added up. Still, Daniel held back. He wasn't here to play detective. He was here to understand, to listen, to remember what it felt like to be on the other side of the glass. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. It was hot, over 100 degrees, and the AC in Bay 4 had been acting up for days. Daniel and Mateo were elbow-deep in a transmission fluid exchange, sweat soaking through their shirts. Vince had been in a mood all day, snapping at anyone who asked for help. Around 3 o'clock, he called Mateo over to the back storage area, near the old tire rack. Daniel was tightening a filter housing, but he could hear their voices. Low, tense. "You messed up the alignment report this morning," Vince said. "Customer called. Said the numbers didn't match what we told him." "I double-checked it," Mateo replied, voice shaky. "I swear." "Don't swear to me," Vince cut in. "One more screw-up like that oil leak last week and I'll make sure you never get certified. Hell, I'll tell corporate you stole tools. You'll be blacklisted before you're 20. Silence. Daniel's hands froze on the wrench. His breath caught in his throat. He didn't move. Didn't blink. He just stood there, heart hammering, as the words settled like dust in the hot, oily air. Mateo didn't say anything. Just walked back to the bay, eyes down, shoulders slumped. Daniel wanted to follow. To say something. To do something. But he stayed put, gripping the wrench until his knuckles turned white. Because in that moment, he wasn't the CEO. He was just Danny, powerless, angry, and painfully aware that the system he'd built was failing the very people who kept it alive. And for the first time since he'd walked into that shop, he wasn't sure staying hidden was the right choice anymore. The words kept playing in Daniel's head long after the shop lights went out. "I'll make sure you never get certified. Blacklisted before you're 20. They weren't just threats, they were sentences. And they'd been spoken not in some back alley garage but in a shop that carried his name, his logo, his promise of trust and quality. He lay awake that night in his motel room, ceiling fan creaking overhead, staring at the water stain on the ceiling like it might give him an answer. He'd come here to listen, but now he'd heard something he couldn't unhear. The next morning he almost didn't go back. Not out of fear, but out of shame. How many other kids like Mateo had walked through these bays eager and hopeful, only to be ground down by someone like Vince? How many had quit, not because they couldn't do the work, but because the weight of being watched, judged, and threatened was too heavy to carry? But he went, because leaving now would mean abandoning Mateo, and that wasn't who he wanted to be, not as a CEO and not as a person. When he arrived, Mateo was already there, hunched over a diagnostic scanner, eyes red-rimmed but focused. He didn't say much, just gave a quiet morning and went back to work. Daniel didn't push. He knew words wouldn't fix this, only action would. Over the next few days, Daniel watched more closely than ever. He noticed how Mateo double and triple-checked every step of his work, how he avoided eye contact with Vince, how he stayed late to redo things he'd already done correctly, just to be sure. The kid was drowning in fear and no one seemed to notice, or care, but Daniel did. He started small. During breaks, he'd sit near Mateo and talk about engines, real talk, not fluff. He'd ask how his sister was doing in school. He'd share stories from his own early days, carefully edited so they sounded like someone else's life. "I once stripped a bolt so bad the whole job took 3 extra hours," he said one afternoon. "Thought I'd get fired on the spot." Mateo looked up, surprised. "You? You seem like you've always known what you're doing." Daniel shook his head. "Nah, I messed up plenty. The trick is not letting one mistake convince you you're no good." Mateo didn't say anything, but his shoulders relaxed, just a little. Meanwhile, Daniel kept his ears open. He listened during coffee breaks, during cleanup, during the rare quiet moments when the radios were off and the lifts were still. He heard whispers about Vince changing work logs, about him taking credit for others' repairs, about how he'd gotten his promotion not because he was the best tech, but because he knew how to play the game with the old manager. One afternoon, while organizing spare parts in the back, Daniel overheard 2 senior techs talking near the tire rack. "Vince told me last week I'd be reassigned if I didn't cover his shift when he bailed early," one said quietly. "Yeah. Well, good luck reporting him," the other replied. "Carl's got his back. Says Vince keeps standards high." Standards? Or just fear? They walked away before Daniel could hear more, but the word stuck. It wasn't just Vince. It was a system that rewarded control over care, intimidation over mentorship. That night, Daniel made a decision. He couldn't stay hidden forever, but he also couldn't just storm in as the CEO and fire someone on the spot. That would solve one problem and create 10 more. People would be scared to speak up. Others would think it was a show. No, he needed proof. Not just for HR, but for himself. He needed to know this wasn't just one bad apple, it was a pattern. So he started documenting. Not with fancy reports, but with simple notes. Dates, times, what was said, who was there. He kept his phone in his pocket during breaks, voice recorder running when conversations turned serious. He never recorded anything private or personal, just work-related interactions, the kind that would hold up if questions were asked later. He also started watching Vince more carefully. Not in a creepy way, just paying attention. He noticed how Vince always stood too close when correcting someone, how he'd smirk when a trainee fumbled, how he'd take the easiest jobs for himself and dump the messy ones on the new guys. Then came the moment Daniel had been waiting for, and dreading. It happened during a busy Friday afternoon. A customer had brought in a luxury SUV with a check engine light. The diagnostic showed a faulty oxygen sensor, a common fix. Vince assigned the job to Mateo, then disappeared for a supply run that lasted over an hour. Mateo worked carefully, following every step. But when he reconnected the battery, the engine wouldn't start. He checked the connections, the fuses, the ground wires, nothing. Panic flickered in his eyes. Daniel stepped over. "Let me take a look." He scanned the system again and spotted it immediately. The sensor had been installed backward. A rookie mistake, but an easy one to make if you'd never seen that particular model before. Daniel fixed it in 2 minutes. Just then, Vince walked back in, coffee in hand. He took one look at the SUV and frowned. What's going on here? Mateo had a small mix-up with the sensor orientation, Daniel said calmly. Fixed it. Vince's eyes narrowed. He walked over to Mateo, voice low but sharp. You couldn't figure that out yourself? After all the time I've spent watching you? You're wasting everyone's time. Mateo opened his mouth to explain, but Daniel cut in, gently but firmly. Actually, I've seen seasoned techs flip that sensor. It's a weird design. Happens to the best of us. Vince turned to him, surprised. Since when do you know so much about German engineering, Danny? Daniel shrugged. Read a lot. Watch videos. Ask questions. For a second, something flickered in Vince's eyes, suspicion maybe. But he just grunted and walked away. Later, as they cleaned their tools, Mateo whispered, Thanks. I didn't know what I'd do if that customer left unhappy. You would have figured it out, Daniel said. You're smarter than you think. But inside, he knew the real danger wasn't the mistake. It was the environment that made Mateo too scared to ask for help in the first place. That evening, Daniel sat on the edge of his motel bed, flipping through his notebook. He had enough. Not just the threats, but the pattern, the favoritism, the manipulation, the way Vince used his position to control, not to teach. It was toxic, and it was happening under Daniel's name. He thought about going to Carl, the foreman, but Carl clearly trusted Vince. Without hard evidence, it would be Danny Ruiz's word against a respected lead tech, and Danny Ruiz didn't exist. No, the truth needed to come from the top, but not yet. Not until he was sure Mateo was safe. Not until he could fix not just the problem, but the system that allowed it to grow. He closed the notebook and looked out the window at the neon glow of the strip mall across the street. Tomorrow he'd keep working. Keep listening. Keep protecting Mateo as best he could. Because the real test wasn't just exposing the rot. It was making sure something better grew in its place. And that couldn't happen from the shadows. Soon, very soon, he'd have to step into the light. But for now, he was still Danny. And Danny had a brake job to finish in the morning. The tension in the shop had thickened like old engine oil, slow, sticky, and hard to stir. Daniel could feel it in the way people spoke in shorter sentences, in the way eyes darted toward Vince whenever he walked by, in the silence that fell over Bay 4 whenever he stood near Mateo. But something else had changed too. Mateo was standing a little taller. Not because the fear was gone, it wasn't, but because someone was watching his back. Daniel made sure of it. He started staying late after shifts, under the excuse that he wanted extra practice. In truth, he used that time to quietly coach Mateo through tricky repairs, to walk him through diagnostic codes, to show him how to read a wiring diagram without getting lost. They worked on old project cars parked out back, junkers the shop used for training. And with each passing evening, Mateo's hands grew steadier, his questions sharper, his confidence quieter but real. You've got a good feel for this, Daniel said one night as Mateo successfully traced a short in a taillight circuit. Some people never get that. You were born for this work. Mateo wiped his hands on a rag and actually smiled. Small but genuine. Feels good to not mess up for once. You weren't messing up, Daniel said. You were learning. There's a difference. But while things were improving between them, the pressure from Vince was building. He'd started watching Daniel more closely, his gaze lingering a beat too long whenever Daniel answered a question or helped another trainee. One afternoon, while they were both refilling coolant reservoirs, Vince leaned against the workbench and said, You know a lot for a guy who just moved here from El Paso. Daniel kept his voice light. Spent a lot of time under hoods as a kid. My uncle ran a garage. Huh, Vince said, crossing his arms. Must have been one heck of a garage. There was no accusation in his tone, just a question wrapped in suspicion. Daniel let it hang in the air. He didn't flinch, didn't over-explain, just nodded and went back to work. That night he made a call, not as Danny but as himself. From a payphone near the laundromat down the street, he dialed his head of HR. He didn't give his name, but he used a secure verification code only he and his legal team knew. I need you to quietly pull all personnel files for the Phoenix 32nd Street location, he said, voice low. Focus on disciplinary records, customer complaints, and internal reports from the last 18 months. And I need a discreet security review. Audio logs, shift patterns, anything unusual. He hung up before she could ask questions. He trusted her. But the fewer people who knew what he was doing, the safer everyone would be. Back at the motel, he spread his notes across the bed. He'd recorded 3 more incidents. Vince taking credit for a complex transmission diagnosis that Dev had actually solved, Vince yelling at a trainee for using the wrong brand of degreaser, and, most damning, a conversation where Vince told another lead tech, "If corporate ever asks, you saw me here all day. Got it? It wasn't just bullying. It was deception. And it was happening on Daniel's watch." The next big test came sooner than he expected. A regular customer, a retired school teacher who drove a well-kept sedan, brought her car in for a routine tune-up. Vince assigned the job to Mateo, then disappeared again, claiming he had to run parts to another location. But Daniel knew better. He'd seen Vince leave in his personal truck, not the shop van. Mateo worked carefully, double-checking every step. But halfway through, he noticed something odd. The spark plugs looked newer than the rest of the engine. He mentioned it to Daniel. "Could have been replaced recently," Daniel said. "But pull one and check the gap anyway." Better safe, Mateo did and found the gap was way off. Worse, the torque specs were wrong. Someone had rushed the job. If left unchecked, it could cause misfires, poor fuel economy, even engine damage. Daniel's stomach dropped. This wasn't just sloppy. It was dangerous. He helped Mateo redo the plugs properly, then quietly flagged the issue to Rosa, who was overseeing the bay that day. She frowned. "Vince signed off on this last month. Said it was routine maintenance, no issues." Daniel didn't say anything. But Rosa gave him a long look, like she was seeing him for the first time. Later, when Vince returned, Daniel approached him calmly. "Hey, the teacher's car. You worked on it last month, right?" Vince shrugged. "Yeah, why?" "The plugs were torqued wrong. Gap was off. Could have caused real problems." For a split second, Vince looked rattled. Then he recovered. "Must have been a bad batch. Happens." "No," Daniel said, voice steady. "It happens when someone's in a hurry." The air between them went still. Vince's eyes narrowed. "You calling me out, Danny?" "I'm just saying the customer trusts us with her car. We owe her better." Vince stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Daniel could hear. "You're getting a little too comfortable for a trainee. Watch your step." Daniel didn't back down. He just held his gaze and said, "I'm watching. Always." That night, everything changed. As Daniel was locking his toolbox, Mateo pulled him aside near the employee entrance. "I heard Vince talking to Carl," he whispered. "He said he thinks you're not who you say you are. He's asking around, calling old shops in El Paso, trying to verify your story." Daniel's blood ran cold. He hadn't expected this. His cover was thin, built on lies that wouldn't hold up to real scrutiny. "He also said," Mateo continued, voice trembling slightly, "that if you're lying about your background, you could be fired, or worse, reported for fraud." Daniel put a hand on Mateo's shoulder. "Listen to me. Whatever happens, you're not in trouble. You've done everything right. But what if they find out you're—" "They won't," Daniel said firmly. "Not before I'm ready." He walked back to his motel with a new urgency. He couldn't wait much longer. The risk was growing, not just to his cover, but to Mateo, to the other trainees, to the soul of the shop itself. The next morning, he arrived early. Before anyone else showed up, he went to the office and slipped a sealed envelope under Carl's door. Inside was a printed summary of his findings, dates, quotes, patterns, along with a note. "This isn't about one person. It's about the kind of shop we want to be." He didn't sign it, but he knew Carl would recognize the handwriting if he looked closely enough. And if he didn't, well, the HR team would be arriving within 48 hours for a surprise culture audit. That was the story they'd tell. The truth would come later. As the day unfolded, Daniel kept his head down but his eyes open. Vince was jumpy, snapping at everyone, checking his phone constantly. Rumors started swirling, about an anonymous tip, about corporate investigators, about possible layoffs. But Daniel stayed focused on the work, on the people, on Mateo, who was now handling a brake job with calm precision, no longer flinching at every sound. By closing time, the air was electric with uncertainty. As Daniel wiped down his station, Vince approached him one last time. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Vince asked, arms crossed. Daniel met his eyes. "Not yet." Vince studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You're not like the others. I don't know who you are, But your trouble, Daniel almost smiled. Maybe. But sometimes trouble is what it takes to fix something broken. He turned and walked out into the warm Arizona evening. Heart pounding not with fear but with purpose. Tomorrow, the truth would begin to rise. And this time he wouldn't be hiding from it. The morning air was still cool when Daniel pulled into the shop parking lot, but the tension was already thick enough to cut with a wrench. Word had spread fast. Corporate was coming. Not just any visit, but a full culture and compliance review, starting with a mandatory team meeting at 9. No one knew why. No one knew who'd blown the whistle. But everyone could feel the shift like the moment before a storm breaks. Daniel didn't wear his usual coveralls today. He'd gone back to his real clothes. Dark slacks, a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows. No tie, no suit jacket. He wanted to look like himself, but not like a boss coming to scold. He wanted to look like someone who'd been through the same grease, sweat, and doubt as everyone else in that room. When he walked in, the chatter died instantly. Eyes widened. Jaws dropped. Rosa froze with a coffee cup halfway to her lips. Dev dropped a socket, let it clatter to the floor without picking it up. Mateo stood near the back, face pale, gripping the edge of a workbench like it was the only thing holding him up. And Vince? He went still as stone. His face didn't change, but his eyes did. They flickered with something between disbelief and dread. Carl, the foreman, stepped forward, voice tight. "Mr. Reyes, we weren't expecting you." "I know," Daniel said quietly. That was the point. He didn't go to the office. He walked straight into the main bay where the whole crew had gathered. Techs, trainees, parts runners, even the receptionist from the front desk. He stood on an overturned plastic crate, not because he needed to be higher, but because it was what people did here when they had something important to say. "I've spent the last 3 weeks working alongside you," he began, voice calm but firm, not as the CEO, not as some name on a paycheck. As Danny Ruiz, a trainee who wanted to learn just like Mateo, just like Eli, just like anyone who walks through these doors hoping to build a life with their hands. A few people glanced at Mateo. He kept his eyes down, but his chest rose and fell a little faster. "I came here because the numbers on my screen didn't match the truth on the ground," Daniel continued. "I heard stories. I saw fear. I watched good people second-guess themselves because someone made them feel small. And that's not what this company is supposed to be." He paused. Let the words sink in. Reyes Auto Care wasn't built on perfection. It was built on respect, on trust. On the idea that if you show up ready to work and willing to learn, you'll be treated like you matter because you do. He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many as he could. "I'm not here to fire everyone. I'm not here to point fingers and walk away. I'm here because I owe you better. And I'm going to fix it, with your help." Then he turned to Vince. "Vince Holloway," he said, not with anger but with disappointment. "You were put in a position of leadership, not to control people but to lift them up. Instead, you used fear to keep them quiet. You took credit for others' work. You threatened a trainee's future over honest mistakes. That ends today." Vince didn't argue, didn't shout. He just nodded once, jaw clenched, and stepped back. Daniel didn't announce a firing. He didn't need to. "You're placed on immediate administrative review," he said. "HR will handle the rest. But know this, intimidation has no place in this shop, not now. Not ever." Then he shifted tone, softer, warmer. "But this isn't just about what went wrong. It's about what can go right." He turned to Rosa. "Rosa, you've been here longer than most. You treat every customer like family, and every new tech like your own kid. I'd like you to co-lead this shop, alongside Dev, who's got the skills and the heart to guide others." Rosa's eyes filled with tears. Dev looked stunned, then proud. "And Mateo," Daniel said, walking over to where the young man stood frozen. Mateo looked up, eyes wide, like he couldn't believe this was real. "You've got something rare," Daniel said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You care. You listen. You don't give up even when you're scared. That's the kind of person we need leading the next generation." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "I'm starting a new apprentice leadership program, one where trainees learn not just how to fix cars, but how to lead with integrity. I'd be honored if you'd be the first one in it. And if you're willing, I'd like to be your sponsor." Mateo swallowed hard. Then slowly he nodded. "Yes," he whispered. Then louder, "Yes, sir." Daniel smiled. Just Daniel is fine. The room stayed quiet for a beat, then someone clapped. Then another. Soon the whole bay was applauding, not because they were told to, but because they finally felt seen. After the meeting, Daniel didn't retreat to an office. He rolled up his sleeves and walked over to Bay 2, where a customer's pickup was up on the lift, brakes half done. "You mind if I help finish this?" he asked Rosa. She grinned. "Only if you don't mind getting your nice shirt dirty. Already planned on it." And just like that, he was back under the hood, not as a CEO playing a role, but as a mechanic who remembered where he came from. Over the next few hours, something remarkable happened. People started talking, really talking. Trainees asked questions without flinching. Techs shared tips openly. Even Carl, usually so reserved, pulled Daniel aside to say, "I should have seen it sooner." "I'm sorry," Daniel just nodded. "We all miss things when we're too far from the floor." By lunchtime, the mood had shifted. It wasn't perfect. Healing never is. But there was hope in the air. Real, gritty, human hope. As he sat on a crate eating a sandwich, this time from the shop fridge, not the gas station, Mateo joined him. "You really worked here as a kid?" Mateo asked. "Not here," Daniel said, "but in a place just like it. Sweeping floors, fetching tools, dreaming of the day I could turn a wrench without being yelled at." Mateo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you just send someone else to check on us? Why come yourself?" Daniel looked out at the bays, the clatter of tools, the hum of conversation, the smell of oil and effort. "Because you can't fix what you don't understand, and you can't lead people you've never walked beside." Mateo nodded like he finally got it. Later that afternoon, as Daniel packed up to leave, Rosa called out, "You coming back tomorrow?" He smiled, not as Danny, but yeah, I'll be around. And he meant it because the real work wasn't over. It was just beginning. Building a company that didn't just look good on paper but felt right in the bones. A place where people didn't just show up for a paycheck, but stayed because they belonged. As he drove away, the sun low in the Arizona sky, Daniel didn't feel like a CEO. He felt like someone who'd finally come home, not to a title, but to the truth, and sometimes that's the only thing that matters.